This is the New Way Young Adult Podcast. New Way is the young adult ministry of Franklin Heights Church. This podcast is a sermon from our Wednesday night gathering, and we pray that God would use it in your life as you navigate these young adult years. Nothing new in looking at the book of Ecclesiastes and jumping over to Colossians. So we're going to be in Ecclesiastes 7 tonight, starting off in verse 10, I believe. We're somewhere around there. But if you want to turn there, feel free. We'll get there here in a few minutes. But we're all adults in here. Well, I hope we're all adults in here. I want you to take a moment to kind of flash back. Do y'all remember when you bought your first car or any of that? Anyone remember? Maybe you don't have a car yet, but maybe it's going to happen one day. And the feeling of when someone just handed you the keys, it was a good feeling. When I was, right when me and my wife first got married, I really wanted a truck. And so I had a Hyundai Elantra. I don't know if y'all know what that is, but yeah, I had a Hyundai and it was silver. And I loved that car. It was really good to me. And I decided I wanted to sell it to get a truck and put it on Craigslist. And it went really quick, and I had a price set. Had what I wanted to get from it, but also had my bottom dollar set too, because this is the least amount I'll take from it. And so I put on Craigslist, and a young lady from Liberty University reached out to me and said, "I've been looking for this exact car for quite some time. Have you sold it yet?" And I said, "No, it's still available." She goes, "Well, can my boyfriend drive me down there and we take a look at it? If I really like it, I'd like to buy it." I'm like, that sounds great. So she came down, and I met her and her boyfriend in a parking lot. And I'm like, this is the weirdest transaction that has ever happened to me. I don't know if you ever sold a car before, in the parking lot of an abandoned parking lot. It felt sketchy, but it was fun. And so I sat there, and she walked around the car and looked at everything. And she started asking me some questions. She goes, "Does the horn work?" And I went, "Huh." I'm like, "Yeah, it works." And she goes, "Okay." She goes, Do you have a history of the car?" I'm like, "Actually, I do. I printed everything off." I hand it to her, and she goes, "Fantastic." She goes, "Can you drive it around the parking lot for me?" I said, "What?" I'm like, "Well, I thought we could go on a fun drive somewhere, and you could drive it." She goes, "Oh, no, I'm not going to drive. If I buy it today, my boyfriend's going to drive it back for me." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I drove her around the parking lot, and I don't know. I don't remember what I talked about, but I'm like, this is weird. And I'm like, I just hope this person just goes on. So I get out of the car, and she goes, So she goes, "This is your asking price." I'm like, "It is." She goes, "Well, I've been always told you never pay the asking price." I'm like, "Well, make me offer." She goes, "Will you knock $300 off?" I'm like, "Absolutely, we knock $300 off." She was thrilled. I signed them. I handed her the keys. And then she handed them to her boyfriend, and they drove off. And I'm like, actually, that went a lot better than I thought. It doesn't end there. 1 year later, I get a message on Facebook. And she said, "Hello, I don't know if you remember me." I'm like, "I do." She said, "I live in Missouri, and I commuted back and forth to Liberty." She goes, this is a year later, she goes, "The engine blew in the car. And I was wondering if you could give me a full refund since that happened." In my mind, I went, this is what I was like, man, that's tough luck. I never responded to her. I'm like, hey, you bought the car. And that's the thing sometimes, and this is something I want you to understand really, really quick with that. Maybe you experienced buying a car like that, maybe that. But, once someone hands you the keys to something, that key, it's yours for better or for worse. And here's the thing. Every generation gets handed some keys. And I believe it or not, I think this old Hyundai is a pretty picture of one of the tensions between the generations. Every generation gets handed some keys. You inherited a world you didn't build. You inherited an economy that you didn't create. And you inherited technology that you didn't even invent. You inherited cultural problems, family patterns, opportunities, advantages, disadvantages, and consequences from people who came before you. And that's where this tension starts. Because younger generations can look at older generations and say, look at what you handed us. And older generations can look at you and say, yeah, but what have you been doing with it? And this is where we have to take a hard and honest look. Somewhere between those two statements is probably a little bit of truth. You know, millennials, Gen Z, have legitimate frustrations about the world that we inherited. But Gen X and other generations before us have legitimate frustrations with us too. Because every generation, if you didn't know this, every generation inherits problems that they didn't create. And every generation creates problems the next generation will inherit. People have always been complaining about the next generation or the previous and wishing that they could go back to the good old days. And here's the thing, wishing to go back to the good old days has been something for thousands of years. And Solomon tonight forces a question on us to consider something. And here's the question. Were the good old days actually better? Or do they feel just better because we already know how that story ended? So tonight is not about figuring out which generation ruined everything. It's about learning how to live faithfully in the generation we've been given, and learning to have some grace for the generations that came before us and the ones that come behind us. So Solomon says tonight in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, looking at verses 10 and 11 first, he says this, say not. If you highlight or underline your Bible or take notes, I want you to highlight that word, say not. Why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and an advantage to those who see the sun. Our first point tonight is this. Nostalgia remembers the highlights and edits out the problems. Nostalgia remembers the highlights and edits out the problem. You see, Solomon doesn't begin by saying the old days weren't better. He starts with say not. In other words, watch the story that you are telling yourself, because there is a trap in this sentence saying that things were better back then. Because once you accept that sentence as unquestionably true, you start interpreting everything happening now through that statement. You know, millennials and Gen Z, this is what we have to say. Our parents had it so much easier than us. And then Gen X responds, young people today do not know how good they actually have it. Different generations, but the same trap. And Solomon says the kind of thinking isn't necessarily wisdom. And here is the thing about nostalgia. Nostalgia is selective. See, we tend to remember the parts of the past we miss while forgetting the parts that we are glad that are gone. So someone remembers we didn't have social media. We actually talked to each other. True, but that doesn't mean loneliness didn't exist. Some people say people used to stay married. Maybe divorce rates were different, but that doesn't mean every marriage was healthy back then. Or you hear this a lot, people actually used to work hard. Sure, but laziness wasn't invented by Gen Z. Proverbs was warning about lazy people thousands of years ago. And that's Solomon's warning. Something can feel better simply because it's familiar to you. You see, we can also do the reverse. Instead of saying everything used to be better, we can say everything older generations gave us is broken. That's nostalgia flipped backwards. One generation romanticizes the past, while another generation demonizes it. Neither one of these generations see the whole picture. But here's something I think most generations actually have in common. And pay attention to this. You see, our parents and grandparents may look back to the 70s and 80s and say, man, those were the days. Have you heard that from your mom and dad and grandparents? Yeah. And a lot of us look back to the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and we say the exact same thing. Different decade, but the same feeling. But have you ever taken a moment to think about why we love those decades so much? It's because we were kids. We weren't watching, nor were they watching the interest rates. We weren't worried about the housing markets. We weren't thinking about job security. We weren't paying the electric bill or buying groceries. We weren't sitting around trying to figure out whether the country was headed in the right direction. We were worried about what was on Cartoon Network. We were riding bikes. We were playing outside. We were hanging with friends. We were wondering what was for dinner, not how much dinner was going to cost. And here's the thing. We did that, and guess what? Our parents' generation did the same thing. They remember riding bikes until the streetlights came on. Saturday morning cartoons, going to the arcade, listening to music with friends. But while they were enjoying being kids, the world around them wasn't perfect either. There were wars, recessions, inflation, political division, crime, broken families, addiction, fear. They just didn't fully understand it yet, and neither did we. That's one of the reasons the past can feel so much better. We remember it through the eyes of a child, but now we judge the present through the eyes of an adult. To be honest, that's not really a fair comparison, because we're comparing a time when someone else carried most of our problems to a time now that we're responsible for carrying them ourselves. And that's where generations can completely misunderstand each other. We say, you do not understand what it's like trying to buy a house right now. Maybe they don't. They say, you don't understand what we went through growing up. Maybe we don't. Because none of us saw the full picture of what the generation before us was carrying. Were there great things about the 70s and 80s? Absolutely. Were there great things about the 90s and the 2000s? Absolutely. But there were also things that were deeply broken in every single one of them. And what I want to tell you is okay to enjoy the nostalgia. Laugh about how Blockbuster used to be a thing. Talk about the cartoons that you used to watch. Play the old music. Tell everybody how much better Nickelodeon used to be back in the day. Just don't fall into the trap that Solomon warns about it. Don't say, why were the former things better than these? Since it is not wise of you to ask this. Maybe the old days were better. Maybe we just weren't old enough yet to know what was wrong with them. And you see, here's the big picture. Every generation gets handed some keys. You can complain about the condition of the car you inherited, and some of those complaints may be completely legitimate. Imagine this, though. Again, I don't know your upbringings, but just imagine this, though. Imagine that your parents had terrible parents. Just imagine that for a second. And they spent your entire childhood talking about how badly they were raised. That was your whole entire childhood. But because they were so focused on what was done to them, they never realized that they had the opportunity to do something different with you. And now here we are with the same choice. You can spend your whole life looking backward, complaining about what your generation inherited, romanticizing what it used to be, blaming the people who handed you the keys, and never actually fix anything. Because there will be a time when you will have to hand the keys to somebody else. Don't be so consumed with the baggage you inherited that all you do is pass that baggage down. So right now, you have to ask yourself this question right now. What am I going to do now that the keys are handed to me, that are in my hands? Because one day, every single one of us will be handing those keys to somebody else. Solomon says, "For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." Solomon doesn't say you're stupid for missing the past. He challenges the wisdom of living there. There's nothing wrong with saying there were good things back then. The danger comes when there were only good things back then, and then that becomes, therefore, everything was better back then, and then eventually, therefore, nothing good can happen now. That is a trap. Nostalgia can accept yesterday. Wisdom teaches you how to live today. He continues on in verse 13. And he says this, Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. Verse 14, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Our second point tonight is this. You have to enjoy what is good. You have to enjoy what is good. But consider the adversity. You know, I have been asked before, what has been the most difficult season of my life? And if I'm being transparent, honest, and authentic with you, I would say this season that I am in right now. You know, I've walked through this season and other things in my life where I wanted God to explain himself. Does that make sense? Why did this happen? Why now? Why did you allow this? What are you doing? And if I'm being completely transparent with you, I wasn't looking for wisdom. I wanted answers. Because I thought if I could understand why something happened, maybe I could finally be okay with it. You know, but it says in Deuteronomy 29:29, the hidden things belong to the Lord our God, but the revealed things belong to us. As young adults, you have to understand this verse. And this is a difficult verse, not just for myself, but also for you. Because it means there are some things that I or you may never get to know. There are questions about my life and your life that God has promised never to answer. And in this hard season, I'm going to be really honest with you, I've never felt more alone, but also I've never felt forgotten. And here's the thing that God has taught me. I've had to learn there is a difference. That there is a difference between considering and understanding. If you underline in your Bible or write down or highlight. In verse 14 it says, in the day of adversity, consider. It doesn't say in the day of adversity, try to figure everything out. And sometimes I can look back at some difficult seasons and see exactly what God did through it. And other times when I look back, I still don't understand it. And maybe wisdom is knowing which questions God has answered and which ones I have to trust with Him. The secret things belong to God. Sometimes it means this happened. I don't understand it all. So what has God actually put in front of me right now? What can I learn? What needs to change? What do I need to appreciate more? What kind of person am I becoming through this? And there are things that I do not get to know. Here's the thing, guys. Enjoy the moments of prosperity. But in the times of adversity, consider. See, that exact same concept is true generationally. None of us chose when we were born. Gen X didn't choose the generation they inherited. Millennials didn't choose theirs, and the same goes for Gen Z. But it says in the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. You see, this is what happens when we complain by comparing. Gen Z, to you, this is a lot of times what comes out of what we say. You have no idea what it's like growing up with social media, COVID, housing prices, and this economy. Millennials, we say we graduated into a recession. We had to live through all the stuff of 9/11. We saw the rise of school shootings and watched homes become so unaffordable. While Gen X says, you think we had it easy? We grew up under the threat of nuclear war, watched the AIDS crisis unfold, lived through divorce rates, but also back then where your dad or mom could go to work and just never come back. And we had to enter adulthood through recessions and rising violent crime. And in that, we're not considering our adversity anymore. We are comparing. And this is not just a general or a personal problem. This becomes a spiritual problem just as well. Because we can get so used to seeing life through the lens of what we've been through, and we start doing something without even realizing it. You know, someone sits down with us and starts talking about what they're going through. Maybe they're struggling with singleness. Maybe their relationship is not as good as they thought. Maybe they're overwhelmed at work. Maybe they're lonely, anxious, exhausted, or just going through a really hard season. And sometimes before they're even finished talking, we are already thinking to ourselves, you think that is hard. You don't know what tired is. I wish I had to deal with what you had instead of what I have to. And maybe you don't actually say it out loud, but that thought is looming in your head. Sometimes we do share our own experiences because we're genuinely trying to relate. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I have been through something similar. But we have to be careful because somewhere along the way, relating can turn into competing. Instead of listening to their struggle, we start measuring it against ours. Instead of asking, how can I carry this with you? We're thinking, let me explain why mine is much heavier. We don't consider, we compare. And some of us have been through things that have genuinely changed us. And I'm not asking anyone to pretend those things didn't happen or they didn't affect you. But you have to understand this. There is a difference of being shaped by what you've been through and being defined by it. Because if my pain becomes my identity, eventually I can start viewing everyone else's pain through mine. And without realizing it, someone else's struggle can start feeling insignificant because it doesn't seem as bad as what I experienced. Suffering was never supposed to be a competition. There isn't a trophy for being the most hurt person in the room. Think of this right here. When someone trusts us enough to tell us they're hurting, they shouldn't have to prove their pain is bad enough before we all will care about it. Think about that. When someone trusts us enough to tell us that they're hurting, they shouldn't have to prove that their pain is bad enough before we'll care about it. That's not what we're called to do with each other. We weren't meant to measure each other's burdenness. We were meant to help carry them. And sometimes we think we're relating to someone and we're actually minimizing them. And instead of sharing each other's burdens, we're hurting each other with our comparisons. And maybe that's another part of what it means to consider in the day of adversity. I can acknowledge what I've been through without making everything about what I've been through. I can learn through my pain without making my pain my identity. And then I can sit beside someone who's hurting without needing to convince them that I have hurt worse. Their burden doesn't have to be heavier in their mind for me to help them carry. You see, you have to understand that Solomon is trying to tell us something very important. From an earthly viewpoint, life often seems unfair, especially in the time of adversity. But here's the thing that we have to accept. God has ordained all of these things. Therefore, we must develop a spiritual viewpoint for living this life. And that's now when we jump over to see what Paul has to say in Colossians chapter 3, verses 13. And Paul, like I said, if you're joining us, we have been looking at what Solomon is saying is life is under the sun. And Paul gives us the heavenly mindset that we need to have. So Paul says in Colossians 3:13, he says this, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, he says, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Point 3 is this. Every generation needs more grace than you think it does. Every generation needs more grace than you think it does. You see, we've talked about what each generation has been handed, what each generation struggled with, and how easy it is to look across that generational divide and begin to compare. But eventually, we had to stop asking which generation had the best, screwed it up, or made things worse, and start asking a better question. How are we supposed to treat each other? And see, once we start considering what we've been through, we also have to decide what are we going to do with the people who have frustrated us, disappointed us, misunderstood us, or maybe even handed some of us baggage that we weren't ready to carry. Notice Paul doesn't say there won't be complaints. He doesn't say that people won't frustrate you. He doesn't say there won't be legitimate reasons to be hurt. He assumed there will be something to bear with. There will be complaints. There will be things that need forgiveness. The question is, what are we going to do with them? And that's true between individuals. It's true in families. And I think it's true when generations are trying to understand each other. Maybe the generation before you got some things wrong. Guess what? So will you. Maybe they had blind spots that they couldn't see. Guess what? so will we. Maybe they handed us some things we wish they had handled differently. But eventually, we're going to be handing those things to a next generation, some things that wish that we handled them differently too. That's why we need grace going both directions. And this is important to understand this. We can tell the truth without turning each other into villains. We can tell the truth without turning each other into villains. Paul says, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you. You see, in that word as, it might seem insignificant, but it's very important. See, the idea is the sense of this. It means just as, or in the same manner as, or even to the degree that. So think about this, read it this way. Forgive each other as the Lord has given you the same degree of forgiveness that He has given you. Paul isn't just saying God forgave you, so you should probably forgive people. He's pointing to God's forgiveness as the measurement. It's saying this: forgive in accordance with the forgiveness you have received from the Lord. And that is an incredibly high standard, because if I'm deciding how much grace someone deserves based on what they have done to me, I can always find a reason to withhold it. But see, Paul changes the measurement. The question isn't simply how much forgiveness do they deserve from me. The question becomes, to what degree have I been forgiven by Christ? Because how much has Christ forgiven me? Completely. How much grace have I needed? More than I actually deserve. So before I start keeping a record of everything another person, another generation has gotten wrong, Paul forces me to remember the record that Christ has forgiven in me. And in that, when you look at that, that changes how you look at people. Maybe the generation before us got things wrong. Maybe they had blind spot they didn't recognize. Maybe we're dealing with consequences of decisions that you and I never made. And eventually the generation behind us will probably deal with the consequences from the decisions they didn't make either. One day they're going to look at us and say, how could your generation not see this? And when they do, we're going to hope that they extend to us the same thing Paul is telling us to extend now. And that is grace. Because every generation needs more grace than you think it does. And the standard for grace isn't how much they deserve, it's how much we have already received. Older generations have wisdom younger generations desperately need. And younger generations see blind spots older generations desperately need to be pointed out. We need each other. You don't have to agree with another generation's perspective to take their pain seriously. You don't have to excuse another generation's mistakes to recognize what they can teach you. Grace gives us room to do both. That makes the answer to Solomon's question almost ironic. The old days weren't necessarily better. They were somebody else's complicated days. So the question tonight that lies with you and me is this: what am I going to do now that the keys are in my hands? Because at some point, I have to stop looking backward. I can't change what happened to me. I can't change what other generations have done. I can't relive moments that nostalgia said were the best days. I can't change what somebody said to me. I can't change what my family got wrong. I can't go back and rewrite seasons I wish I had got done differently. And there are things that I may never understand. There are things I may never get the answer for, but now the keys are in my hands. And maybe you have spent years thinking, if they hadn't done that, if this hadn't happened, if my life looked different, then maybe I would be different. But Jesus didn't come to give you a better past. He came to give you a new life. The gospel isn't Jesus helping you make the best of what you've been handed. It's Jesus doing for you what you can never do for yourself. You see, we talk about what other people have done to us, but we eventually have to face what sin has done to us. Because my greatest problem isn't the generation before me or behind me. It isn't my circumstance. It isn't things I wish that had been different. My greatest problem is sin. And I can't fix myself. And that's why Jesus came. He went to the cross to carry sin that wasn't even his. It was ours. He died in our place. Think about that. He was handed things that he didn't deserve. But what did he do? He faithfully carried it anyway. Our job, our role, is to follow Christ. So if he took on things that weren't even his to carry, but he carried it anyway, how much more are we supposed to reflect that? It's fun saying you're a Christ follower until it's time to carry the keys. When it's time to carry a cross. And maybe right now you're carrying something that you never asked for. And I'm not trying to minimize. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm not trying to do any of that. But the greatest example to the generations behind us and the generations before us is not what we can fix. It's not about trying to fix the economy. It's not trying to fix the political crisis. It's not trying to find better mortgages. It's not trying to figure out how we can make eggs 50 cents again. It's none of that. The best thing that we can do is to carry a cross that maybe wasn't ours to give, and hopes that we can point future generations to the one that carried every single sin and shame of all humanity. And here's the thing, guys. You can spend your 20s, your teens, your 30s complaining about everything and have missed the best years of your life being a reflection of Christ. So now, as we realize what the keys have been handed to us, what are you going to do? There are going to be times when life is going to be so joyful and it's going to feel like you're prospering. Enjoy those. God has ordained it. But there are going to be times when adversity comes. And Solomon says, consider it. Sometimes, when those joyful times you want to embrace it, but when adversity comes, it's taking a step back. And this is wisdom. That's something I truly haven't mastered yet, trust me, but it's sitting back saying, God, I know I can't fix this. I don't know why this has happened, but how can I faithfully represent you in this time? Consider. That's something that the world really doesn't do much anymore. We complain, but I'm telling you tonight, consider the adversity. Carry the things, even if it wasn't meant for you to carry. Because that is what Christ did for you. And in that, our hope is that we can point to other people something that's greater than ourselves. You've been handed the keys. What are you going to do with it tonight? Let's stand. We're about to enter this time of worship. And just with every head bowed, and we need to get our hearts right for this time of worship. Maybe I just want you to take this moment, just take a moment, and just speak to God personally.